Hi, I'm Mary, and this is part 2 of our Introduction to Fairlight tutorial. In this section, we're going to work on some of the more specific mixing techniques to finish up our scene, such as we're going to do EQ, balancing out our tracks, some dynamics, and some other elements to get to our final mix. So let's get started. If you're following along, you'll want to open up the timeline 7 balance clip levels, which is right here. You can just go to the timeline pop-up menu to find that timeline. So here we have our checkerboard dialog edit, and what we want to do is now get to balancing the levels for each individual audio clip. So we have 3 different character tracks. We have Emiliana's track here, we have Philip's track, and then we have Ada's voiceover track. And we're going to start with Emiliana's, and I'm just going to go to these 2 clips right here to look at the levels. And we're adjusting volume levels. We might as well zoom in here. So let's just zoom in on that particular clip, so we can really see those. I'm also going to bring up our mixer, and we're going to talk a little bit about what we want to focus on with our levels. So I'm on Emiliana's track, and you notice that's track 1. If you're ever not sure of your track, just select the track, and that way you can see that it highlights in both locations, in the mixer and also in the track itself. Now what you're focusing on is, I've mentioned this before, I'm going to solo this track, and you can solo it from either the track header or from the mixer. And if I solo that track and play it, you can see the levels right here in the mixer. Now these same exact levels will also show up in the track header as well as the monitoring panel up above. What I want to focus on is what the levels actually are. Let me zoom in on this a little bit. When you're dealing with dialogue, you want to make sure your dialogue levels, they'll be in the yellow on that particular clip. I'm going to play that again. And this yellow area right here is really where you want to focus your dialogue, and that's going to be averaging around -12 to -10. So that your average is going to be the thick part of the meter. Let's do that again one more time, and you'll see when it's solid color, that's going to be your average. And there's also peaks. So if you look for any of those horizontal lines that stay in the mixer, whenever you see a horizontal line, that's going to show you your last peak. And then when you see the solid lines inside of the meters, those are going to be your averages. And so you can focus on those. And we're really looking at this area right here in the timeline in your meter between -10 and -15. And when it comes to dialogue, occasionally you'll want to go below that if it's an inaudible, a whisper that you just barely want to hear but you want to know what they're saying. You would play that as low as -20, never below that, because then you just won't be able to hear it. And then if it's a scream, that if you have a blood-curdling scream that's going to take over the entire scene, you want that scream to really be audible, then you would want to play that at as high as -3. But that's also the same level as explosions and other major effects, so you want to only use those sparingly when you need to. So let's focus on this little area right here. I'm going to play that shot one more time. Okay, so that's where I want it to go, and you notice the peak was way up there at -5, so I can clearly see right there in my meter what's going on with this particular clip. I'm going to jump out of here, and now we're going to adjust it on the clip itself. All you have to do is just lower that level, and I can just manually raise or lower it. Her levels are fairly consistent. I can look at the waveform and see that. Let me make it a little bit bigger so you can really see her track. Just zoom in, and now we can really focus on her clip as I play that through. Okay, I've lowered it, and now it looks like my average level is better. If I want to look at the inspector, I can actually select a clip, and I can see that I've lowered it to, it's at it's actually at 13. So if I play this through, if you double click a clip, it'll reset it to the starting point, or this is what I originally had to work with, and I had it as high as -13 was where it just was, which I think is a pretty good level. Okay, so you're watching your meters. So once I've done it with one clip, let me zoom out a little bit, let's move on to her next clip, and I'm going to assume it's going to be very similar to the first clip. So you can use the visuals as a guide sometimes to get things close. So let's try that. Let's look at the waveform here, and by just lowering these levels a little bit, I can see they're about the same height as the one on the other side, and I can play that, and let's just see what that level is. Let's look at our meter. Identify the person on the left. Looks like I'm right there, exactly where I want it to be. Again, we're aiming for that yellow zone. Now that you know it, you will always know, look for the yellow when you're dealing with dialogue, and I can see that those levels are fairly consistent. So these clips were easy. Now let's look at something that's a little more challenging, and we're going to go into one of Philip's clips where his levels are fluctuating more. Part of it is for his performance, and part of it is just the words that he's using, and we're going to have to adjust them within the clip itself. Let's go down to Philip's track. I'm going to shift Z for a second. I'm going to come down here to the part where he talks about the explosion. So let's navigate down to about 1 minute and 9 seconds in the timeline, and then I'm going to zoom in a little bit so I can really see that clip. Again, always adjust the interface as needed so that you can really focus on the parts that you need, and notice that you have a lot of flexibility to do that. So I'm going to just zoom in a little more. And something I will point this out, that I got this scene came from editorial, and clearly someone had made some adjustments to the levels. But when I'm about to work on them, I like to start from scratch and find out what I really have to work with, and I'll add my own points and levels if I need to. So if you ever want to reset the levels of a clip, just select the clip, and over in your inspector you can just reset that, and you can right here reset the clip back to its original levels, and that way you can make all the changes you need yourself. You can even select all the clips in an entire track and reset them all at once and start from scratch. So I'm going to hide my inspector, and so now we're going to focus on this particular clip and the levels in that clip. So I'm going to move that up a little bit. And so I can just look at this waveform for a minute, and I can see that this section is significantly lower than this part here, and I need to make sure all of them work. So one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a couple of keyframes in between those two phrases. So I'm going to just Option click right there on the overlay, so I can freely adjust those two different areas. I'm going to go ahead and raise this up a little bit. I can just tell it's a little bit low, and then I'm going to play this and see it in context. And one of the things, let me solo this track. I had Emiliana's track. Let me come up here for a second. I had Emiliana's track soloed. I got to make sure you unsolo your tracks as you go, or else you may not hear any audio. So now that I've got Philip's track ready, let's play it.
Just 2 hours ago.
Okay, and I can see, again, look at your meters. I could see that the peaks were in the red, a little bit too hot, so I'm going to go back in there and look at that again. There's a shortcut that's very useful when you are repeating a certain section and you want to play it more than once, and that shortcut's going to be, all you do is move it here, and if you want to listen again, it's under the playback menu, and you just go to this section right here where it says play again. And what that will do is when you do a play, it'll play back whatever the last thing is you did. So we can use that numerous times in order to play it over and over again. If you want to, the shortcut is Option and L for listen, or listen again, is how I remember it. So let's go ahead and play that section, check the volume. I'm going to bring it down just a hair, always looking at my meters for Philip's track now, and let's play that again.
Just 2 hours ago.
Okay, and it looks like I've got it right where it needs to be. Now let me talk about those levels for just a minute. I said anywhere between -10 and -15 is okay for your dialogue, but you always have to put it in context with the character and what they're actually doing. If you have 3 people in a room, someone who's larger, who's got a big booming voice, you would play them closer to -10, and if you have someone with a softer voice, then you would play them a little bit lower, closer to -15. The average for most of the people that you're dealing with is going to be right around -12, and that's what you're going to do. So once we have that, let's go ahead, and I've got this part. It's working pretty well for me. Let's look at the next half of this clip. In this case, to make it easier, I'm going to turn on my loop playback right here, and I'm just going to mark an in point and mark an out. I for in, O for out, just like you would do on the edit page. So just mark your clips whenever you need to, or in this case, mark the timeline for loop playback, and that will make it easier to do. So now that I have this set, I'm going to just look at my meters and play this section. To do loop playback, it's Option and the /. Okay, I've got some issues with this section, so we're going to zoom in a little bit. Let's make it even bigger to work with. And there's a lot going on in this clip. As you notice, you're going to see there's louder sections, there's quieter sections, and so we're going to have to deal with this a little bit at a time. And if you're thinking to yourself, wow, there's an awful lot of work on one clip, just think about it. Visual effects artists spend a lot of time on one frame. If you're a colorist, you spend time on every single clip. The same thing happens in dialogue editing or balancing your dialogue. Every clip matters for your entire scene or your entire show. So let's get in here and really look at this clip. I'm going to select this and make it even a little bit bigger so I can focus on that even more. By selecting the track, I can make that track a little bit higher. And now we're going to focus on what's happening here, this beginning section. I'm going to add a couple of more keyframes just by option clicking, and I can raise this section up a little bit more. And let's see how that's working. Okay, the boom is okay. It can be a little bit quieter. I'm okay with the boom. But then we have something happens here. Do you see this giant section on the waveform? It's here, and there's another one further down. And there's a name for that. Those are called plosives. And what a plosive is, it's where your microphone gets a really big power hit from trying to pronounce consonants or words like that starts with P's and B's, and it really takes a hit because it takes a lot more power to produce those sounds. And so what happens is it gives you a spike, as you can see right here. And in fact, he's saying the word explosion.
Explosion.
Right there when he says explosion. I'll start it back earlier.
Oh, there's this explosion that surrounded the whole ship.
Surrounded the whole ship, and it's got that P on it again. So when you have plosives, what they can do is they're going to throw the levels off for everything else. When you're trying to balance your track levels, those plosives are always going to make things too loud, so you're going to end up lowering the other parts of the dialogue too much because you're trying to accommodate those plosives. So it's always better to just lower them individually. So all you need to do is put a set of keyframes on there, just option click, and you can lower them. You don't have to do it too dramatically. You want it to sound natural, but you see how I can adjust that and bring those down so they're closer to the normal dialogue levels that you already have. Let's also do the one here at the end. For ship, just option click twice, and I'm going to bring this down as well. I don't have to overdo it. Let's just bring it down and tame it. And then I'm also going to bring down the end of the shot. We don't need too much there. So you can always go in and make adjustments within your clip as needed. So let's come back here and listen.
Oh, there's this explosion that surrounded the whole ship.
There we go. So we just balanced out his shot. Now you're probably thinking, wow, that would take a long time. It does. It takes a little bit of time to get this through, but it's just like color correction, only we're doing audio correction. And since dialogue is the most important thing in your project, it's a good idea to take the time to really do it the right way. And if you go through and you balance all of your dialogue clips within all of your tracks, I've never touched my meter. And what that means is when it's time to start mixing, the faders can just be used to make sure that the volume levels are good overall and balanced with the other tracks. And I'm not going around chasing dialogue that's all over the place because it was never balanced in the first place. So it's worth taking the time. And now that you know how to do it, feel free to try that. And we're going to move on to another concept here with our balancing of dialogue tracks. Now I have those in and out points. I'm going to clear those by hitting Option X. I'm going to resize these tracks, make them a little bit smaller, and we're going to come down here and look at Ada's track. Now in this case, this character Ada, let's make that a little bit bigger. It's always about zooming in as you need to. And I'm making this a little bit bigger so we can focus on her levels now. Now this is a different scenario because the Ada character theoretically is a computer voice. She's not going to breathe in that case, and her volume levels should be much more consistent because it's not produced by a human. So in that case, what we need to do is make sure their levels are much more even. And so when I check these levels, we can make them almost exactly the same. So let's go ahead and make sure we have not soloed any of our other tracks. Let's check. We still have Philip's track is soloed, so let's unsolo that and come over here. Now one nice trick is if you accidentally have something soloed, instead of chasing your tracks, you can always look at your mixer. And if you notice here in the mixer, it's also going to show you when a track is soloed. So I can unsolo Philip's track here, and I can solo Ada's right here in the mixer, which is useful. Let's check out Ada's track now. I'm going to just play this first. Let's do the first two clips. I'll mark an in point and an out point so we can listen to them. And let's just start playback.
Emiliana Newton. Yes.
Okay, so the levels aren't bad. I'm going to check this one again.
Emiliana Newton. Yes.
Okay, those are hitting right in where I want them to go, right there in that yellow zone, and those seem to be consistent. So I'm going to hit Shift-Z so I can see the rest of the clips. And I'm going to show you another useful trick that we have. I'm going to clear off my in and out points. And remember, when you want to zoom, wherever your playhead is, that's what you're going to zoom to. So I'm going to move my playhead over this clip right here. We have this set of 5 clips from Ada. I'm going to move over one of those and then zoom in, and notice that it's going to put that right front and center where I need it to go. And what I want to show you is some of these levels I can tell are lower or higher, but we're going to use a different method here since these are very consistent, is we're going to try normalization. Now if you're an audio editor, you know normalization may be a little bit of a cheat, but it's like having an auto white balance, only instead you're using it for your volume levels. Let's try it on the third clip for Ada. We'll just try it right here. Now by the way, if I double click on her volume, you'll notice that resets it. So these are the these are the levels that we started with. If I right click on the clip and choose normalize audio levels, what that's going to give me is this window right here. Let me zoom in on that. And this is where we can normalize. And what it's going to do is it's going to allow me to set where I want the peak to go. Not the average, but the peak. And so if I know where I want her volume level to go, all we need to do is, let's lower this. As you know, we want our volume levels to be, again, between -10 and -15. Her other clips were closer to -10, so let's go ahead and set our peaks to that level as well. So I'll set my peak to -10, just drag on that fader to get it there. And what will happen in theory is, if the peak is at -10, then the average should fall just below that within the -12 range. So let's try that. I'm just going to click normalize, jump out, and now when I play that, we'll look at the meters.
Philip Veda.
Yeah, it looks like I nailed it right on the -12, exactly where we wanted it to go. So now let's do the rest of our clips all at once. I'm going to hit Shift-Z, and we can select all of our clips, just drag across them. There we go. I've selected multiple clips now. And when you select multiple clips, you can right-click and you can actually normalize them all at once. Again, I wouldn't recommend this for complicated dialogue scenes, but in this case, if you have very similar sounding voice or something that's more monotone, you can make those adjustments. Let's try it. I'm just going to right-click and now choose Normalize. And this time, if you look at the interface, this now gives us a choice because it's multiple clips. We can do it relative to each other or independent. Let's choose independent, and that way, if you're doing it independent, it's going to look at the levels for each one individually. So let's do that. Again, let's set it to -10, which is right where we want it to go, and click Normalize, and that's it. Now we should have all of those clips balanced for Ada's track. Let's try, randomly try this one right here.
I cannot explain this discrepancy.
Yep, her levels are right where we need them, so perfect. So we now have, in theory, these clips are balanced. Now if you want to take up the challenge and go in and try to balance some more of these dialogue clips, feel free. If not, we're going to move on to the next timeline where these are already finished and we can move on to the next thing. So let's come up here to our different timelines and go down to DS. And now we're going to focus on de-esser. And if you're wondering what is a de-esser, what that does is it helps remove the sibilant inside of our shots, because as we speak in dialogue, and like right now I'm speaking into a microphone, there's that whistly sound that can happen, the sibilance that can be picked up by the microphone, sometimes by proximity or just depends on the mic. And what we want to do is we just want to dial that back, because the louder the voice is, the more wattage we have behind it, the more you're going to hear those, and they begin to get irritating to listen to, and you definitely don't want to irritate people while they're trying to watch a dramatic scene. So in order to adjust that, let's go in and we're going to look at one of the clips on Ada's track. I'm going to go down to, just navigate yourself down to this clip right here that's around 44:22 in your time code. It's the fourth in that series, and I'm going to play just this shot. I'd also like to mark that clip. I'm going to use my range selection tool to mark it with in and out points so that I can easily loop the playback. And let's listen to that clip. I'll solo it.
I cannot explain this discrepancy.
Okay, now I don't know if you hear that whistly S at the end in there, but I definitely hear it. And again, when that's in the middle of a scene, or if you're in a theater listening to it, that's really going to stand out. So we want to adjust that. Now before I add my de-esser plugin, I'm going to go ahead and show you on the EQ for that clip where that sibilance is, so you can start targeting it yourself and understanding a little bit more about where that sibilance lives on the clip. So let's go ahead to the inspector and select the clip. And when you select the clip, scoot over a little bit. When I select the clip and I look over at the inspector, here we have our clip EQ. Let's go ahead and turn on the EQ. Now the equalizer we have for every single clip, and you'll see it anytime you select a clip, it's going to appear for that particular clip. In this case, I just want to work on that one right here on Ada's track. And we're going to focus just in the sibilance area. So I'm going to turn off all the different bands for this equalizer. So we're only looking at band number 3. Zoom in a little bit here for you. Now when you're looking at the equalizer, right here is my band 3. As you can see, I can sweep that band right here. And we actually call this, when you're working with audio, anytime you move back and forth, and we call it sweeping because what I'm doing is I'm listening as I'm dragging the frequencies to try to find where something sounds either good or where it sounds really bad. So let's go ahead and we're going to start loop playback on that clip.
I cannot explain this discrepancy.
And like I said, I'm going to first make it sound really bad, and then I'll make it sound a little bit better. So let's go ahead and make sure that, let me punch out for a second. Make sure that I'm doing my loop playback on that particular clip. So Option / so we can hear it.
I cannot explain this discrepancy. I cannot explain this discrepancy.
And what you're going to do is you're going to sweep back and forth and listen to really where it sounds the worst, okay? Because when that really stands out, you'll know exactly where that is. And on this clip, as I listen to my frequency, it's going to be right around 7 kilohertz. You're really going to hear a lot of whistly S's. So you never keep that. You're only doing this so you can really find where the issue is and then target it. So again, I'm going to start the playback there.
I cannot explain this discrepancy.
And that's where it's really the worst. So now what I'm going to do is we're going to go the other direction and move down and just see what it sounds like when we remove a little bit of that sound. So again, Option L.
I cannot explain this discrepancy.
So by taking it down just a little bit, I've really removed that issue. First I had to find it, and then I can pull it down. So I'm going to turn off the EQ right now. I was just using that as an example so you could see it and hear it for yourself. And now we're going to go and get the de-esser, where we have a plugin that will do some of this work for us. As long as you understand what it's doing, then you can go in there and change it. So let's go ahead and hide our inspector. We're going to go over to our effects library, and we want to apply our de-esser, which is this effect right here near the top. Now the thing about the de-esser is, if somebody has sibilance, chances are it's not on one clip, it's on all of their clips. So one of the reasons that you break up dialogue and do a checkerboard edit and move all the dialogue to its own track is so you can treat each person's voice accordingly. And so in this case, instead of putting the de-esser on the clip, let's put it on the entire track for Ada, and that's going to do nothing but improve all of Ada's clips. So we have added the de-esser to Ada's track. I'm going to hide the effects library now, and I'm just going to move this plugin out of the way a little bit so I can still see the plugin interface, and I can see the clip, and I can even see my mixer. So adjust as I need to. And what you're going to see is the sibilance is going to be between 4 and 8K. Generally, that's where it lives. And so the idea is first you figure out where it is, which we did when we were using the EQ, and then we just reduce it. Now, this particular plugin is also a compressor. So not only is this going to be reducing our sibilance, but it's also going to be compressing the sound around it. So you have to be a little careful. If you take out too much, you're going to give your character a lisp. So let's go ahead and start the playback, and we'll listen.
I cannot explain this discrepancy.
So this is without having.
Explain this discrepancy.
So that's without.
I cannot explain this discrepancy. I cannot explain this discrepancy.
See, if I pull out too much, you can start to hear a little bit of lisp in the voice, which you definitely don't want to do. But sometimes finding that gives you the exact place where you need to lower your sibilance. And so once I have that, and it's right around 7K, just like I had before, I'm going to now bring this up just a little bit. Another thing to think about whenever you're working with these plugins, or especially when you're affecting somebody's voice, is you try to do it in small increments, maybe 3 decibel increments, something small. You don't want to overdo it because it's cumulative, and eventually it's going to start becoming too much, and it'll be more noticeable. So in this case, we just brought it down a little bit. Notice on the left it shows you how many decibels you're adjusting, and this shows you the frequency that you're working with. So this ought to take off the edge, and now we can close up this plugin, and we have actually adjusted the S's on her entire track, which is great. Let's go ahead and unsolo that track, and we can now move on to the next element that we're going to work with. Let's come over and go ahead to timeline number 9. If you go to 9, the de-essing has already been done, and you can see what we're going to focus on is the dynamics. Okay, and in fact, timeline's called dynamics for a very specific reason. If you happen to look at this timeline, you'll see that there's a lot of keyframes on Philip's timeline, on his different track and his different clips, and that's because it took a lot of keyframes to really get those levels good. So once we have those, we're now going to take it to the next step. So what is dynamics? Dynamic range, if you're working with video or color correction, you're dealing with your black and whites and the difference in between. When you're talking about dynamic range for audio, you're talking about the difference between no sound and the loudest peaks. So it's basically changing the range of your signal. In this case, the dialogue is between -10 and -15. That's a 5 decibel range, and that's it. And you're really trying to keep your dialogue within that range. And if you can do that, then it's all going to have a similar loudness, and it's all going to stand out above all of those other tracks. If you have dialogue levels that are all over the place, then they're going to get buried in some of the other sound effects or the music, and you're not going to hear them as well. So this helps give it that professional edge. So in order to adjust that, we have on every single track, let's go to our arrow tool. We're going to focus on Philips track for this. And we have dynamics controls right here inside of the mixer. And in the mixer, you have controls for every single track, including EQ to adjust the entire track instead of the clip. And here we have dynamics. It's this section right here. I want to do it for Philips track, so I just have to look down here and find Philips track. There it is. Open up the dynamics window for that. And this is where you can control the dynamics. And this is where we can take the loudest peak and we can reduce them and bring them closer to the shortest peaks just within his track. And so let's look at what's in here in our dynamics window. We have an expander. And what the expander does is if you have it's just like if you had a flat image and you wanted to kind of expand the blacks and whites in that image. In this case, if you use the expander, you're taking your sound, if it's very narrow in its dynamic range, and expanding that a little bit is what you're doing. The gate, on the other hand, that's to the gate is going to put a floor. It's going to basically say, I'm not going to hear any sound that's below a certain threshold. So that's good for removing low-level noise, for example. That's what your gate is. On the far right, we have a limiter, and that limiter, notice it looks like a hard ceiling. That's exactly what it is. Your limiter is a hard ceiling. It says no sound is going to go above this threshold. So if your delivery requirements say it cannot get above a certain amount, you can set that right here with your limiter. And then the final is our compressor. And the compressor is the most commonly used dynamics. It's on every single track, and what that's doing is it's taking a threshold, particular sound level, and it's taking anything that goes above that and bringing them closer together. So reducing the louder parts and bringing them closer, which will reduce your dynamic range, and that's the goal here. Keep it nice and tight. So let's look at the dynamics for Philips track, and I'm just going to show you on this particular section right here. I'm going to zoom in. Let's look at the clip that starts at 114.12, right here.
He also sustained some hull damage, but
Okay, so he's saying it also sustained some hull damage. I'm just going to give you an idea of how this works. Now, obviously, we've already keyframed this and brought these pretty close together already, but in using the compressor, we're looking at the entire track, not just this particular clip. Now, with the compressor on, this threshold is going to say, zoom in on that a little bit. If you look at the threshold, this is where the lowest level is that we're working with. That's our threshold. Now, if his volume level for something quiet is closer to -20 on something, we could actually set this to 20. The ratio is saying anything that goes above my threshold, I'm only going to hear, if it's 2 to 1, for every 2 decibels over my threshold, we're only going to hear one of those. If it's a 5 to 1 ratio, then for every 5 decibels that are over or louder than my threshold, we're only going to hear one, or only one of those. And so what that does is it really helps reduce the levels and bring them closer. So in this case, let's see where his levels are. I'm going to mark his clip with my range selection tool right here. Bring us out of that zoomed playback, and I'm just going to start this and look.
he also sustained some hull damage, but
Okay, so right here you can see this is our input level, and the input level is what we're starting with before we go into compression. And I can see that some of his words are actually falling way down here below where I really want them to go. So I'm going to change my threshold, let's say to -20, to catch some of those words that are a little bit lower, or those syllables that are even lower. And then we're going to have a ratio, let's say 3 to 1, and just to kind of narrow that range a bit. So let's start the playback.
he also sustained some hull damage, but It's nothing.
Okay, and then what we want to look at is over here our output meter, because that's going to show us the change that we've applied. And if we've reduced our levels too much, we can bring them back up with what's called the makeup. And that's basically going to make up the sound that we've reduced. If we've reduced it too much, we then need to make it up, and we can do that right here. So let's look at our meters. Let's look at that clip.
We also sustained some hull damage, but
Okay, so now his levels seem a little bit too low, so we could just make those up right here. Let's do it again.
we also sustained some hull damage, but
Okay, there you go. And so we've just adjusted his levels a little bit. And so again, by just adding a bit of compression on your tracks, that's going to help make up for anything you may not have caught when you were adding your keyframes and balancing out those tracks. So that is your compression. You notice once you've added compression to a track, you can see a graphic for it right here on your dynamics. Now, one thing we could do is, because Ada is a computer, if you ever listen to a voice that's recorded on a computer or a phone or something like that, you'll know that they have a lot of compression. They really squash that sound. And so we could do that to Ada's track if we wanted to. Let's just bring up her dynamics, and let's put a really heavy compression on that one. We'll lower the threshold. We'll lower the threshold to maybe minus 25 is fine, somewhere low, and they'll catch the lowest end of anything she happens to say. And then let's really crank up that compression. This is not going to sound great, by the way, but it'll work for a computer. And we're going to bring her up to maybe a 12-to-1. So it's really going to squash that sound. And let's see how that works on Ada's track. I'm going to select her track. And let's move over so we're actually at some of her clips, and let's just see them.
Emiliana Newton.
are you sure?
Yes.
And bringing up the makeup gain.
Ada, identify the person I'm speaking with.
Philip Maida.
Identify the person on the med lab.
Philip Maida.
And so you notice how her voice really now sounds compressed. It really sounds like it's lost some of its human nature, which is exactly what we wanted to do. Then we can adjust that makeup gain. And the nice thing is this has just been applied to the entire track. So now we have added some excessive compression to her track. Let's do one other thing. Let's go in there and let's monkey a little bit with her EQ as well. So let's move up to the equalizer for the Ada track. And when you bring that up, you'll notice we also have a 7-band EQ on every single track that's already there. And this is great for improving sound, but it's also good in this case for degrading it or making it sound a little bit different. So in this case, notice I have my EQ for, it tells you right here which track it is. And I want to set an in point right here at the beginning of Ada's section and an out point, just so I can get these 2 clips are fine. So if I mark those, that way we can just play that one section and really hear what we're doing to the sound instead of waiting. And then when I start playback, I'll just listen to that.
Emiliana Newton.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Okay, so now that we have that set, what I'm going to show you is if I turn on my band 1, this is my high pass filter, which means only the higher frequencies are going to pass through there. And this is great for eliminating any extra sound, low end stuff that no one's going to actually need in their voice to improve their voice. It's just the low rumble in the room or something like that. You can get rid of that right here with band 1. What we really want to focus on is band 6, because this is where we're really going to eliminate the high frequencies, because this is a low pass filter, which means only the lower frequencies are going to get through. So you can see the shaded area are the things that we're getting rid of. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come in here and we're going to eliminate this. And I'm going to show you as during playback how much I can diminish her voice. So much so that if you've ever listened to, been in a hotel room, or you've been in a room where you can hear sound from the other side of the wall, that's because high frequencies don't make it through the wall. What you're only hearing is the low end or the bass end. So if we eliminate it too much, it's like creating a barrier. In this case, we just want to eliminate it enough so it doesn't sound natural and it kind of feels like it's coming out of a speaker. So let's try that. We're going to start playback.
Person in front of me.
And I'm just-
Emiliana Newton.
And I'm just going
Are
to
you
take
sure?
out all that high end.
Yes.
Person
Okay, not too much.
Emiliana Newton.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Okay, so we've just eliminated enough that it sounds pretty good. I'm going to tighten it up on both sides. And just for fun, I'm going to raise a little bit of the band 4 right there in the middle, just to kind of give it a little bit of punch in there for some of those mid-level frequencies for her. So now she's going to sound a little more like a computer. Let's close up the EQ, and you notice the graph is showing right here. So not only can EQ be used to improve different sounds, but also can be used, like I said, to degrade them. So now that we've done that, let's look at one more thing we can do for our sound design, because she still sounds
Emiliana Newton.
she's starting to sound more like a computer, like she's coming out of a speaker, but I'd like to take it one more step and use another one of our different plugins. Now, if you've been following along and you'd like to get to this section, just go into your timeline and open up the EQ and chorus if you want to. In this case, I'm just going to stay right where I am and finish this one off. So let's go ahead and go to the effects library. And we're going to go down here and look for the chorus right there, our chorus plugin. Now, chorus plugin is used a lot in music, but it also will be useful for Ada's track. So let's go ahead and drag the chorus onto the entire track, close up your effects library. And if you're wondering what does chorus mean, it means exactly what it sounds like. It takes one voice or one sound, and it's going to duplicate it and add a little bit of delay and a little bit of modulation, just like what would happen in a real world if you had a lot of people singing at the same time. No matter how much rehearsal, there's always going to be a slight delay between the voices, slight pitch discrepancies between the different voices, and this emulates that. And you can also use it to extremes to really make it sound like a robot voice or something else. So in this case, let's just take this and we're going to go to one of the presets, and then the top left of any of our plugins you can find your presets part right here, and we're going to choose the dramatic plugin preset right there. So now we've added the dramatic plugin preset for our chorus, and if I start playback, let's listen to that section. Let's just listen to her voice.
Emiliana Newton.
Okay, you notice now she really does sound much more computer, not too much, but just enough. Now, one thing I want to point out too on this plugin is on all of the plugins you have the ability to adjust your wet, dry signal. And just so you know, wet, if it's wet, that means it's fully affected. If it's dry, that means there's no effect whatsoever applied to it, and you can choose anything in between whenever you need to. In this case, we'll go with it almost full, so that way we get a really interesting sound to it. Go ahead and close it up, and now we have our full scene with all of our characters and everything is balanced, and we're now ready to move on to the next section. So very cool. I think our dialogue is done. Now we can get into sound design. Let's move on to the next timeline, which is going to be 11 sound design. Okay. If you open up this sound design timeline and hit Shift-Z, you'll see all the work that we've done so far has already been applied. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create that sound effect we were talking about a few minutes ago. Remember, if you happen to be doing the first part of the section, if you did the first part of the tutorial, that you created a marker to make a heart monitor sound effect. Well, it's time for us to actually create the heart monitor sound effect. That's this marker right here. We're going to make a sound effect. Now, to do this, I don't need to use my mixer. All I want to do is, and in fact, at this moment, I don't even need my meters. All I want to do is create a track for this. So let's create a new track. And in fact, yeah, let's make a new track and let's put it with the respirator sound effect. So add tracks. This one will be stereo. And let's go ahead and put it underneath our, let's put it, let's see, underneath the drone so that it's going to be right here, which is fine. It can be our respirator, it can sit right there above the respirator. And let's go ahead and name it heart monitor so we know what it's going to be. There. So we have our heart monitor right here. And then we're ready to start recording. Now you can do this one of two ways. You can create your sound effects right in the timeline, or if you're building sound effects from scratch, it's sometimes nice to work with them in a separate timeline because this is an art form and sound design, it can get messy, and it's nice to be able to get in there and make a mess, create something awesome, and then bring it back into your main timeline. So let's do that. Let's go over to the media page. And let's just create our new timeline. You can do it right here in your tutorial timelines if you want to. Just select the bin and just say anywhere in that empty bin in that space, right-click timelines and say create new timeline, or just press Command N to create your timeline. Let's call it heart monitor. And you can even put your initials next to it if you want to create something special, and there it is. I have my new timeline for nothing but creating our sound effects. The other thing I want to do is I'm going to make an extra track in here. Let's make one more stereo track because we're going to record two different things here. The first one, at the top, we're going to make noise. Go ahead and name it as noise. And the second one, we will make our tone, okay, for our heart monitor. Now, where do we get these sound effects if we're going to make them? Well, we're going to use our built-in oscillator. And that's going to live right here under the Fairlight menu. So if you go to the Fairlight menu, you can find right here is our oscillator. It lives inside of the test tone settings. So just click test tone settings and it's going to open up right here. And this gives you access to your oscillator. This is where we can make noise. We can make different noises if we want to test our output levels, and we can also record different sounds or tones that we can use for special effects or sound effects. So in this case, let's start with the first track, and we're going to click this options menu, and by doing that it brings up our patch input output automatically for our oscillator. So go ahead and click on that, and now you can see here's my test tones. Over here on the left is the source, and now we're going to choose noise for this first one. We have noise, and we also need to choose the track, and we'd like to go ahead and patch this to the noise track. You notice that we named the track noise to make it a little bit easier here. If those are both selected, which they are, then we can come down here and patch. And so now those are set. And one thing I'm going to do, just because this might be a little bit noisy, is I'm going to hit my dim button just on my system so that it's not too loud, and then we can arm the track. And when we do that, you're going to hear the noise that we have selected for our oscillator. I'm actually going to mute this just for the video. You can listen to it on yours if you'd like, but we are ready to record that noise. Let's go back up and get our test tones settings again, and let's listen to the two different types of noise that we can record. I'm going to unmute this for a second. We have white noise, which is all frequencies full on. That's why it sounds the way it does. And then we have pink noise. Okay, and I'd like to record some pink noise. I'm going to actually mute the track, and I can still record it even though the track is muted. So I'm going to just record a little bit. All I need to do is hit record, and there is my pink noise. Okay. Now something interesting about this pink noise, and I'm going to stop my recording, just hit stop, and now we have a nice set of pink noise. I'd like to bring up the meters for a moment, because some of you may be familiar with this if you've ever calibrated a system or listened to your different system, and you're wondering, well, what levels am I actually listening to? Let's go back and look at this. I just recorded that pink noise, and it's at the default of minus 15 decibels. Let's see where that sits. I'm going to unmute the track. Where does that sit on my meters over here? And this starts to get a little bit interesting. Let me mute that. Stop playback. Because we can actually use this noise, and we can actually start looking at our loudness meters and see a correlation between some of these different levels as we get towards our mixing. So for example, let's change this. Instead of minus 15, let's change the level to minus 23. And if any of you work with finishing or mixing, you know that those are the targets for our loudness meters. So by lowering that, I can now listen to it or re-record it. And you notice the levels are now dead on center 0 at minus 23 for my loudness meters. Well, you know something else that's very interesting about those loudness meters? Let's also look here at our main output. And if you look at your main output, you're going to notice that it's right there at minus 15. So this is actually very valuable because it also means I can set up my levels. Let me mute that. But it means you can set up your levels for dialogue. I can use this test tone sound level by setting it to minus 3, which is my loudness output level, and it actually is going to match with minus 15. So if your dialogue levels are good, you're already mixing for your loudness for your output. So just pointing that out because it's very useful, and some people use that noise for setting up their system. Another choice we have, we've already recorded that noise, is let's come down to the next track down here. We need to also patch our tone, and you can either patch noise or you can patch your tone, one or the other at a time. So now let's go in and patch the second track, patch our input output, and now instead of noise, we're going to deselect the noise and unpatch it, and we're going to go to just the oscillator. And if you click oscillator, that's going to give you your different tones you can work with for creating a sound effect. And we're going to now select the tone track and patch. And as soon as we patch that, now we're going to be listening to this tone. Let's arm the track. You probably recognize that 1 kilohertz tone. That's what we use to also calibrate systems. and work with those. And you notice that this auto also is set up for, there's my 0 on my loudness meter as well. So depending on what you're used to working with, that's our tone. Now in this case, I'm going to mute that track. You don't really have to listen to it while I'm playing that back. But now we're going to use this tone and record a little bit to make our heart monitor. And literally we can, now that you know how to patch and you know how to access that, we can create our own sound effect in just a matter of a minute or two. So first thing I want to do is record a little bit of that tone. So I'll start recording. I can mute it or not, it's still going to record. So I'm just going to lay off a little bit of that and then stop playback. And once I've done that, let me unmute the track and see if I have it. Okay, so we have our sound effects. So now we're ready to create our heart monitor. So you don't need a lot, just enough to work with. And I'm going to undim my sound and I'm going to make this track a little bit bigger. And let's look at what we have. There's my signal for my heart monitor. I've recorded just a little bit, and this is going to be really easy to do. We have the sound, right? Now all we have to do is create a piece that's about 5 seconds long, and we're just going to copy and paste it into a pattern, and then we're going to bounce that into a single clip, which is rendering it into a clip, and bring it back into our other project. Just a matter of seconds. So let's start at the beginning. Actually, let's go to the end of this clip, and once we're there, I'm going to zoom in a little bit more so you can really see what I'm doing. If I want to move one frame left or right, I can just use my left or right arrows. So let's move one frame to left. And if you ever noticed a heart monitor, it's not actually a frame. It's going to be a little bit longer beep. So let's make it 5 frames to the left. So, okay, let's make it about 5 frames wide. Select this clip, and if you remember, all we have to do to split this is come up here to the razor tool and click. Now I have that single piece of audio that I can use now to create my pattern. Next thing I'm going to do is select that clip, and you can copy and paste these clips just like you would, like I said, a word processor. So I'm going to just copy the clip, and if I want to move, instead of a single frame at a time, if I want to move 5 frames at a time, I'm going to use Shift and the right arrow, and that moves 5 frames over, and then I'm going to paste it. I'm going to do that again and paste it, and you see what I'm doing? I'm just pasting this in here. Very simple, and you can do it as often as you need to create a nice pattern for our heart monitor. Now you can just continue doing that as long as you want to. You can also copy and paste them if you want in a group, but I'm just making some of these so we have the idea of a monitor. Okay, so make it as long as you need to, and then if I play this, there's my heart monitor. But we can take it to the next step. I've just created this pattern, but guess what? We can also change the pitch as well. So select any one of these clips, and if you come up here to the inspector, you can see that we have the ability to change the pitch on these individual clips. Or I could bounce them first to make them one single clip with the pattern and then change the pitch to that. And I think that's what I like to do here. So I'm going to hide my inspector. And I've created this pattern. Let's mark the ins and outs on this. Mark an in point, I for in. Let's mark an out point. Now I'm going to make my out point at the beginning of the last clip instead of the end, so that way there'll be enough space I can duplicate this and loop it together if I want to. And once I have that set, let's listen. Okay, there's my heart monitor. Now the next thing I want to do is I actually want to bounce this and turn it into its own individual clip. To do that, select the track, make sure your in and outs are set, and just come up here to the timeline menu, and you're going to see 2 choices for bouncing. And if you're not familiar with bouncing, in audio, bounce means render. You're going to render it into a brand new clip. So in this case, we're going to bounce this to a new track layer. I just click bounce, and it's now created that track layer. Let's zoom out. You can see, here's my clip right here. I just made this sound effect. I can pull it out. I now have a standalone sound effect, clear my in and out points, and I can use this and copy it and paste it into my other timeline if I'd like to. So let me zoom out, and there's my clip. And again, I can make this longer if I want to, but I've created my first one. I'd like to do one other version of this. Let's play it again. Let's play it from here and see. I'm not sure why it's doing that, but this is my bounce clip. By the way, I did bounce this. Let's go up to the view menu and just show you, if you do audio track layers, you can see that that was actually bounced to a separate layer right there. So that's very cool. So if we like the sound, we can keep this one, or we can create a brand new one or different pattern right here. All you have to do, I'm going to hide my track layers, is if I want to change my pattern, I could just, let's say I want to deselect some of these, or let's say I want to disable them. Let's do that. Let's select every other clip, and I'm going to hit D to disable them, and that way my pattern is a little longer. So I either have the fast heartbeat pattern or I have the slower heartbeat pattern, but it gives me a choice, two totally different sound effects that take just a few seconds to make. So I'm going to come over here and mark my in. I'll mark an out point, and I'll bounce this one also. And we can bounce it again. Go to the timeline, bounce it, and make sure your track is selected when you go to bounce to a new layer, and that way that will actually work for you. Ins, outs, and a layer selected. So now I have two different heart monitor sound effects that I can work with. Let's take both of those, and we're going to copy and paste them into our other timeline. So to select a clip, just drag across it to select, and you can just do a Command C to copy, or right click to copy. And let's go to our other timeline we were just working in. We're going to go to the sound design timeline that we had already created. We can select the track, and anytime you're pasting into a new track, just make sure that you select the track you want to paste into, and it's going to look at your playhead position as well. So wherever your playhead was before. So anywhere I am in this track, if I Command V, I can just paste it. So that way we can bring things from one track to another, and there you have your clips. So I can bring a heart monitor in. So we actually made our own heart monitor right here, which is pretty cool. Now let's go ahead and jump ahead to the next timeline. Heart monitor pasted, and in this example I did the exact same thing, I just made a longer version of the heart monitor, and here it is at the bottom. It's the same one we just did. I just happen to have it in a timeline here, and we also added I added some keyframes to match this respirator so they follow the same amount of volume levels. So, and you notice it also sounds a little bit lower, because the other thing that I can do is I went into the inspector and I actually adjusted the pitch to make it sound a little bit different. So feel free to select your heart monitor and change that pitch to make it sound a little bit different for whatever it is you think works for that particular scene. Luckily, since no one's actually probably been in space, listened to a heart monitor, you can pretty much set it to whatever you want to for this particular example. So now we have this scene with our own little sound design. We've fixed the dialogue, we've added the tracks, we have our sound effects, we've even added our own original sound effect. Let's look at the last couple things we need to do here to really finish off this scene. Let's go over to the timeline 13. This has got our buses, and this is basically a finished version of this timeline where all of the dialogue and everything has been balanced just like we did. The sound effects are all in place, and I've even added the score from the soundtrack and some of the sound effects from the finished soundtrack as well. So we have moved further along, and what we're going to do is just show you how to take this to the next level to get to your mix. And that is, we have all these individual tracks that we're using for our mix. We had all of these different tracks that were required for our dialogue. In fact, I even added a fourth track here called Room, which was a piece of room tone that we extended to make sure we filled in all those gaps with the dialogue. Now what I want to do is, these have all been balanced and are ready to go. I just want to now bounce them into their own stem. And what a stem is it's the final elements for your mix. So whether you have 25 tracks of dialogue or 6 or 3 in this case, you want to bounce those all into one single track so that it makes it much easier for mixing. Obviously for your mixer, they have the access to the other tracks, but this makes it much easier to work with. So in order to bounce your entire tracks, what we can do is we're going to separate these into groups, and we're going to separate these into submixes. And I'll show you how that works right now. Now a submix, let's go up to the Fairlight menu, bus format. And what the bus format does is allows you to create submix buses, or different buses that you can use for like clips. So for dialogue, for example, let's make a submix for our dialogue. Let's also make a submix for our sound effects, just so you can see how that works. And while we're here, in addition to our submixes, let's also create another main, and this main we're going to make it for 5.1 surround sound. Why not? We might need that. And let's also do a main or a main output for just music and effects with no dialogue in case this is going to go to another language and it needs to be dubbed. So we just created all these different things. Let's see if they're the right formats. Our main 2, I need to change the name of that to 5.1 for surround sound. And obviously I need to actually make it 5.1, and I can do that right here in the format pop-up menu. Then let's look at main 3. This was going to be my music and effects, so I'm going to go ahead and change this to M and E for music and effects, and make sure that that is in stereo. And I might change the color of this just to make it unique. And then our submixes, this first one's going to be dialogue, so it should be mono, and I'll call it dial so I know what it is. And change the color. And then we also have our final submix, which was for our effects, or let's say for our background effects, we could do that as well. For background effects, and those would be in stereo. So it's very easy to set up your mains and your submixes, and once you've set those up, all you have to do is assign them. So let's say OK. And then we go up to the Fairlight menu again to the bus assign area. And this is where you're going to be able to assign, these are the tracks, these are the mains, and it's very easy to work with these. So let's start with our dialogue submix. And our dialogue submix is only going to play the dialogue tracks. Right now, you'll notice the available tracks, all of these say M1, and what the M1 means, they're going to the main 1. Okay, and instead of going to the main, I only want them to go now to the submix. So I will unassign those, and to unassign them, I can go to main 1 and then unassign each of those dialogue tracks if I'd like. And I could instead make sure that those are going to my submix. As you can see, it always shows you the initials of whatever it is that you've assigned. So my dialogue will now only go to the dialogue submix. And let's look what else we have. We have a PFX for production effects. Those can go to main 1. We have our drone sound. We have our respirators. I don't want the respirators going to my submix, obviously, so I'm going to turn that off, and so on. So you can just go through and assign things where they belong. Let's go back to our mains. I want to make sure that the main is playing my dialogue submix, which it is, and it's also playing my background effects, and that's good. Now let's go to my 5.1 main, and what do we want to go to that? We want basically everything goes to the 5.1, so we'll assign all. Okay, so in theory you could set it up that way. Now for my music and effects main out, for that one, I don't want to have any of these dialogue clips, so I'm going to select that and make sure that if I assign all, which I just did, I'm going to deselect the dialogue to make sure everything's playing in there except the dialogue. So as you can see, you just kind of have to think through which tracks need to go to which elements. And once I have those set, let's see, our background effects is the last one that we need to do, and we want to make sure that our background effects go to, that's going to be these effects, and whichever ones go to background, that's where we have them. And once you're set, you click Save. And now something really interesting has happened. Let's look up here at the top, and you'll notice that in this upper section, our monitoring panel now shows our different mains. We have our main 1, we have our 5.1 main, and we also have our main 3. And our 2 submixes are both showing here as well, our dialogue, and this is our background effects. Let's go to our mixer, and if you pull up the mixer, you're going to see that the mixer also shows that information right here. You're going to see my different mains in the mixer as well. There they are. There's my mains, main 2, main 3. So whatever adjustments you need to make on your mains or inside of your submixes, you can do that right here. So you also can see the patching, which is kind of interesting. If you're not sure how to patch your tracks, you can just go through here, and let me just zoom in a little bit to show you. You can also patch any track to any of the mains or submixes right here by just selecting or deselecting. So at any time you can, on the fly, make adjustments to make sure everything's going to the right tracks to be monitored. Now let's back up. I'm going to hide my mixer, open my meters, and I'm going to show you now how to bounce these dialogue tracks as I mentioned before. So we've set up our buses, and we've got these all set, ready to go. Let's jump down in case you've just been following along and you want to get to the next section. Let's go to 14, which is for bouncing our stems. In this case, the submixes are all set, everything's ready to go, and what we want to do is bounce the dialogue, which is these right here, into this dialogue track. And to do this, we're going to follow along with exactly what we had done before. We're going to mark ins and outs, or what we can do is we can actually avoid all of that and just use our submix in order to bounce it. So let's come over here and go to the timeline menu and look at bounce mix to track. If you notice, there's a difference between bounce selected track to a new layer, which we've already done, and bounce mix. So when I go to bounce mix, it gives you the choice of any of your mains or submixes, and those can be bounced anywhere you want to a new track or to a track that's already assigned. And in this case, I want my dialogue submix to go to one specific place, and that's that track that I named dialogue. Okay. Now, if you only want to bounce a portion of a track, you can just mark ins and out points. In this case, I just want to do that one submix to this one track. So I'm going to click OK, and I'm bouncing. And what I should get is a single clip at the top, and there it is. That's going to be my dialogue. And inside of that, it would have all of my dialogue clips ready to play and to work with. And it should sound exactly like if I was playing the dialogue by itself. So it's very useful to be able to bounce those and create your stems, whether it's dialogue or music or effects. I can then solo it and play it just like what we have here. And this way we're eliminating all of the faders and tracks and using fewer and fewer as we get to our final mix. So very useful. So that's just bouncing right there in the track. Now let's fast forward to the very last step for our mixing, because now you know about your levels, you know about how to add all the different elements to your tracks. Let's get to our finishing. So in this case, we're going to go to our last timeline, finishing. And here what you're going to see is our finished stems. This is where all of these different tracks have been finished, our bouncing has been done, and this is where all of the different elements for the timeline have been put together in one single timeline. And what we have at the top is we have our stereo mix, which if you play any of this, I'm going to solo just the stereo mix.
Hida.
Okay, so there's my stereo mix. Now we also have our separate stems here. We have different, the naming conventions here are using abbreviations that are very common in mixing. So we have VX for voice, we have SFX for sound effects, and then we have MX for music. And so if I solo these, and you notice you can just swipe when you want to solo multiple tracks. If I solo these, I can hear those all together and monitor the levels.
Emiliana Newton.
Okay, and then the last thing we have is, so there's my stereo, so I could check the loudness levels, make sure everything's right on those individual stems. And then the last one that I'm going to focus on is down here, is we have our surround stems, or we have 6 mono stems that we need to now make sure they're panned to the right tracks and ready to go for their output. So let's look at these 5 tracks, and if I look at any one of these, let's bring up our mixer. And one thing we haven't looked at is our track panning, and so I'm going to point that out right now. Each one of these separate tracks, I'm just going to solo all of these. Each one of these is panned mono right now. I can see that right here in the pan controls. If I double click, you can see that this track 5 is panned right there, dead center. That's going to the center channel, which is generally just for dialogue. And what we want to do is we want to make sure these are panned to the proper channels for 5.1 surround. Now I can manually do this and move the left channel to the left, or we can use another feature and just link this group of mono tracks. And when you link it together, it will automatically pan it for us to the proper channels for our output. So we're going to come up here to the Fairlight menu. We're going to choose right here where it says link group. And when you choose link group, it's going to look for any mono tracks that you have together in your timeline and show those to you right here. In this case, I have 6. I can select the first one, then select the last one, and then it's going to show us at the bottom, there's my 5.1 that I can choose. That's what I've done. And by choosing that, a couple of things have happened. Let's look at this a little closer in the timeline. As soon as I do that, if you notice over here, that on each track header, it's going to show me, here's my left, right, center, that's my LFE for my low frequency effects, I've got my left surround, and so on. So all my tracks have been labeled already for surround, which is great. Let's also look at a couple other things that it's showing us. You see up at the top in the monitoring panel, you see a band across all those. It shows they're linked. You also see a white band right here along the tracks also in the timeline. And finally, let's go ahead and expand the mixer. And you'll notice there's no longer 6 independent mono tracks. Instead, we have one track with a single fader. You can tell if I play any of this, you're going to tell that this is a surround sound because I can see all those different channels moving, and I can see that my panner, if I double click, shows that each channel is going to the proper, it's been panned properly to the right channel. So that's perfect. That's exactly what I need. The only thing that I haven't done is let's turn on our boom here, and we're going to bring that up because our boom is going to be our sound for our that's going to be for the LFE, so for our low frequency effects. And once you've brought that up, you notice it's even showing right here in our pan controls as well. So now that we have that all set, let's do one other thing. I'm going to come up here to my control room. And if I look, you notice I could go to my 5.1 main. And if I listen to this, now I'm going to be monitoring my 5.1 surround main. And as you can see the meters are moving with all those different channels. Or I can monitor my main output, that's my stereo, and I can listen to that as well. All I just have to do is unsolo these tracks and instead solo the others. So you have total control of your tracks as you go, and
There's this explosion.
and you can monitor whichever ones you want. So when you get to mixing, you've now seen how you can bounce levels, how you can work your way around, and now we're all set. The last thing you really need to do is just go to the deliver page and actually deliver your finished mix. So in the deliver page, you're going to have the same controls that you have as far as here's my timeline. I can see all of my different tracks down here. And I basically just need to choose which elements I want to output or render out. In this case, you can choose all different types of outputs. In this, I want to just do my audio for this example, so I'll choose audio only in the upper left. And let's look at just the audio only tab. You can name your file name if you need to. So if I want to name this Hyperlight Mix 5.1, for example, I could name it that, or I could just name it Hyperlight Mix, or whatever name you need to give it. You can do that here. And we can browse to where it's going to go on the desktop, or I can browse anywhere on my computer where I want this to go. I'll send it to Documents. And then we can come down here and you have a couple choices. You can output things as individual clips or as a single clip, which means the entire rendered file, which is exactly what I want to do here. And then you come down further and we can choose the type of format we want, the bit depth, and this is where it gets really interesting, is you can also choose, let me zoom in, what you're going to output. Remember, I had multiple different mains, I have multiple submixes, and I can choose which one of those I want to include. If I only want my output, my stereo, I will leave it set just like this. What if I want to add something else? Then I'll just add that as well. And so now I also have my 5.1 output, and I can click this again. I can also add one of my mono tracks if I want to. And so I can always do that as many times as I need to. Now I'm going to go back to the Fairlight page for 1 minute. Because if you remember, I linked those tracks together right here in the Fairlight page, but what if my delivery means I doesn't want a linked track, it actually wants individual mono channels? That's no problem. You just come over here to the Fairlight menu and go back to your link group. And I can select this and unlink it just fine. And as soon as I've done that, you notice all the tracks are back to just mono tracks. And if I come over here to the timeline, to the mixer, you're going to see that all of those panning is still there. So every single channel is still panned exactly where it needed to be. So whether it's linked or unlinked, I'm still set up for my output. And now when I go back to the deliver page, it will give me an option for outputting my timeline tracks. I can choose mono timeline tracks, just say plus, and it's going to give me the option of, depending on what type of track that I want, I can actually choose the individual tracks to select, which is very nice. So you always have a choice to output whatever you need, like I said, and you can even choose the tracks right here, and whatever those are going to be, I choose the track number and see it's going to tell me these are my mono tracks, and I can output each one of those as a separate mono track, and it's automatically going to do those in order as well. So once you have the configuration of what you want to output, you can just say add to render queue, set it up. You can choose to output as many different mixes as you want to, and then when you're ready, you just hit start render. So hopefully this gave you a nice overview of how you can do some of the finishing with your Fairlight page and some of your own projects. If you enjoyed working with this and you'd like to actually get even further into it, feel free to check out the training page right here on it. You can access it through the help menu, or you can go to Blackmagic Design and you can go to our training page there as well. And you can even check out the book, Fairlight Introduction to Fairlight Audio Post, where you can go through full step-by-step lessons from start to finish with audio post-production. So hopefully you enjoyed the tutorial and get in there and try it out for yourself. Thank you.